Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this wonderful Seattle Roundtable with multiple members of the NHL Seattle community, as presented by Symetra. We have a great group today to talk about the NHL Seattle relationship with the LGBTQ community in Seattle, to talk about Pride Month, to talk about the art of allyship, and many other things that the NHL Seattle community takes very seriously, and we here at You Can Play Project are very happy to be working with them before a puck is even dropped. And so first I'd like to say my name is Jonas Worth. I'm the Director of Partnerships at the You Can Play Project. I've been working with the NHL over the last few years, and already with the NHL Seattle group since late 2019. We have some phenomenal guests here today, and the focus of today and today's conversation will really be about the Seattle community. First, we have from Symetra, the Senior Vice President of Marketing, Communications, and Public Affairs, Trinity Parker. We have Kyle Boyd, who is the Director of Youth and Community Development with NHL Seattle. Stephen Thompson, co-founder of Seattle Pride Hockey Association. And Joey Gale, co-founder of the Seattle Proud Hockey Association. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us during this wonderful Pride Month event. You know, the basis of this call is that we are all either hockey fans or former hockey players, and that's really what the core of this relationship is all about. You know, You Can Play works in sports spaces, whether it's the NHL, minor league hockey, and sports all around North America and the globe. And the way we achieve our goal of making sports spaces a little safer, primarily for the LGBTQ community, whether that's in the locker room or in the arenas where hockey is viewed by fans, is we team up with our allies. And we take people, whether it's a captain of an NHL team or local interested groups, and we try to create more allies so that they can actually share that message. And I think it's fair that for a team that doesn't even exist yet somehow we're all already fans of, all being based here in the Pacific Northwest. I'd love to hear, in addition to some of the history about your respective organizations, but also maybe have a bit of a conversation about why you love the game, like how the game came to you. From a personal perspective, I grew up in the East Coast. I grew up an Islanders fan, and then, came out to the Pacific Northwest and obviously have had the wonderful experience of not just visiting Seattle, but, being a season ticket holder with some of the other Seattle sports organizations. And I'm very excited for a fresh start because the Seattle community, in terms of, its allies, in terms of, its willingness to celebrate diversity and inclusion is so important to me. So, my allegiances with my New York team might be tested during the next couple of years as this NHL Seattle group gets off the ground. So I can at least say that I have a West Coast team and I'm a hockey fan true and true. So, maybe one of our friends from Seattle can talk about your history with the game and why you came to the game of hockey in the first place, and a little bit about your organization.
I'm actually a Minnesota native, born and raised, and I have some pretty vivid memories of growing up and playing hockey. Minnesota's kind of the self-proclaimed state of hockey, with all of our lakes that eventually turn into ice rinks in the winter. It's a pretty prominent sport that's played out there. So, I have vivid memories of growing up and going out to the pond with my mom, dad and brother, and putting on ice skates, probably as young as like 3 or 4. And then played obviously quite a bit of hockey growing up, organized hockey, as well as a decent amount of pond hockey. Actually moved out to Seattle around 2018, as I mentioned earlier, and joined the Greater Seattle Hockey League. And that's when I connected with Stephen, and we had this idea, as hockey starts to gain momentum out here in Seattle in the Pacific Northwest. What a great way to bring something that we're both passionate about, to the forefront. So that's kind of where the idea started to grow, and the goal is to really make hockey as inclusive for everyone as possible. Who you are and who you love shouldn't, be a barrier to entry to play a sport. Growing up, there were certain challenges that I faced, in the locker rooms. There's all sorts of banter that goes on back and forth. And, there's some language that gets used that, eventually starts to take a toll on you. And you start to feel almost like, as a gay guy, you almost start to feel like an imposter in this, in a really masculine sport. So, my story going through all of that has been interesting, and, it's such a fun sport, and I hope, this organization can help pull more people in.
I've always enjoyed hockey since I was a little kid. As far back as I can remember, my father would take me to the Seattle Thunderbirds games back in the Seattle Center days, where the NHL Seattle team will be playing here next year. And I always remember we would always sit on the glass, and anytime the players were in my zone, I would bang on the glass, which is all too popular, even to this day. And I always had a really good time going to those games. And it wasn't until the 2015-16 and 2016-17 WHL regular seasons that I became more deeply invested in the Seattle Thunderbirds and hockey in general. I've always enjoyed the sport and would periodically go to games, but was never super invested into it until the 2015-16 regular season. I got to know all of the Seattle Thunderbirds players really well, and really started following Matthew Barzal, who now plays for the New York Islanders. And it was when they won the Ed Chynoweth Cup that I really fell in love with the team and the sport as a whole. It was then that the team inspired me to learn to play back in November 2017. And as also a gay man, I entering a very masculine sport that doesn't see any LGBT activity. I was incredibly nervous and didn't know where to start. And so it was then that it prompted me to want to start SPHA with Joey, because I want more diversity in the sport. In underrepresented communities. And so that there isn't that fear. Now, I had a really fortunate experience learning to play, and a very encouraging group. I was connected with a team that is very supportive and inclusive. And so I had a very positive experience. And but again, going back to the nervousness, it took many months for me to overcome this nervousness and wanting to play so badly, but I was just scared going into a sport, not knowing what to expect. And we want to be a voice and a support system for anybody that wants to learn to play or knows how to play, but doesn't play because they might be scared as well.
Thank you for sharing such a personal story, and we hear a lot of those stories, about being a younger hockey player, about locker room culture, and we obviously would like to think that those are things that are changing, but it's not necessarily the norm. We have great cities like Seattle, where generally in youth sport, there really is a celebration of diversity and inclusion, but we still have a long way to go in changing locker room culture. And also addressing fan behavior. I'd love to hear from Trinity about why they are hockey fans, about why your company is so enthusiastic about not just the NHL Seattle club coming into existence, but why you want to be involved and really be a part of the Pride celebration and these relationships with the local LGBTQ community.
We started having conversations with NHL Seattle about a year and a half ago or so, and the energy in this town was just crazy. People are so excited, and we're like, wow, that seems like something that, we really want to be a part of that, right? And so we had a few meetings, and one of the things that we are just incredibly committed to at Symetra is diversity, equity, inclusion. We have been, pretty outspoken about our views on gender equity and pay equity and just inclusion across the board. And so any partnership that, we're going to enter into is going to be with an organization, with a partner that we have aligned values in that area. It's just an essential part of how we do business. And I'm really happy to be having this conversation today because I think it's obviously very timely with Pride Month, but also with everything that's been happening over the last 2 weeks.
And thank you for bringing that up. It's actually the perfect transition to our conversation about the nature of being an ally. And in the last few weeks, all organizations have had to really look internally and do a self-assessment of what their allyship looks like and what does allyship look like in 2020. Because when You Can Play started just under 10 years ago, people were making videos, and that was already in itself a huge statement. And now what we're seeing, not just during the horrible events of 2020, but also as organizations like You Can Play and other nonprofits look at the way we can sometimes forget about, the voices and amplifying the message of the Black community within the LGBTQ community, and to be able to reflect on that and really look at how that has a greater impact. And so I wanted to put the question out to everyone, and whether you want to think about allies to the LGBTQ community specifically, or how some of those approaches of respect and accountability, of meeting people where they're at, can actually apply to other underrepresented groups in the hockey world and society in general, whether that be the Black community, Indigenous populations, which is obviously going to be a significant part of our fan base out here in the Pacific Northwest. So I wanted to put it out there to the group about maybe some ways that your version of allyship yourselves has also changed, and what are the elements that make a really good ally to you?
Yeah, I'll just say a few words on that, Jonas. I think it's a great question. One of the things that we've been thinking about, not only during the recent tragic events and the murder of George Floyd and recent protests calling for justice, but some of the other kind of ongoing challenges even before this specific situation, is how do we leverage some of our tools and resources to encourage people to kind of look within and begin their own journey. Because sometimes, as I've been involved in some of these conversations from kind of a younger age and into now in this position, I think that when people feel like they're able to start a journey and kind of take those first initial steps in learning and understanding and empathy, those can be really powerful first steps, but really nervous and sometimes intimidating first steps. Asking questions, reaching out and getting new readings or material that you're not traditionally comfortable with, and really challenging some of your own perceptions about yourself and your community. I think that for us as an NHL organization, and with great partners both within the community and corporate partners like Symetra, we've been able to look to their example at times and say, hey, this is how other organizations within our community are stepping up. How can we better support them and leverage our resources to kind of further that message? And I think that's one of the things that we're really excited to take on, is not necessarily putting ourselves at the forefront and saying, this is what we're doing and we're the leaders on this, but really saying, this is our community and we just want to work with some of the other amazing community voices that we have, and kind of leverage our megaphone, as it were, to amplify those voices.
In the context of Pride Month and the events occurring, the protests across the country, the tragic killing of George Floyd, I think there's, you look at the intersectionality of even how Pride started and how this movement started. You look back several years ago, you get Stonewall, and that's kind of, the historical turning point. And a lot of folks, don't necessarily know the history of how these events and how a lot of this equality and equity has come about, at least for the LGBTQ community. So it's important to, understand and look that, Black and brown folks have been a part of this movement since day one, and it's essentially because of them that a lot of the progress exists today. You look back at that history and again, look back today, a lot of these events are occurring, and it just makes it even more important that, it's not about just one group of people playing the sport. Our association is Seattle Pride Hockey Association. And pride can stand for everything. It can stand for queer folks. It can stand for different backgrounds, Asian folks, Black folks, everybody should be playing this sport. And I think it's so important to recognize even some of the privilege as white folks, myself growing up in a state where a lot of people who looked like me played hockey, and it was essentially, overcoming some of the barriers to play were so easy. Whereas in some communities around the country, it's not as easy. And, you look at Seattle as a growing hockey hub. How do we reach some of these populations and kind of jump some of these barriers? Playing hockey is a pretty expensive sport. You look at skates and sticks and helmets and all this protective gear and jerseys. And then on top of that, you're paying for ice time, which is expensive. And even finding a sheet of ice is sometimes challenging. So, you look at allyship. How do we look at some of these communities, some of these young folks, and, get a stick in their hands, get them interested in hockey, bring their favorite players to school someday if that's what that looks like. But, extending beyond just getting kids to play, I think it's so important to make the space safe itself. And I think that takes shape in so many ways. And I think, NHL Seattle, I think, is a great place to start as a lot of people start looking up to you and saying, here's our new shining light in the community. Let's do this together. So.
But, allyship is so important, right? You do not make change without allies. The minority population will never be able to make the changes needed without friends and allies. And you start to, really see that with the LGBTQ community, over a generation, right? I mean, people used to be scared to be at work, to be out, right? And used to, and maybe they were afraid of being fired, although not anymore, right? But they were afraid of maybe not being promoted, or maybe, being held back in some fashion. And so they weren't out. And as more people started to come out, all of a sudden people are like, oh, wow, my son or daughter is gay. My colleague is gay. My neighbor is gay. It's like they start to see, that these are real people who they care about and who they love, right? And that's when, that hearts and minds really start to change, is when it all of a sudden it impacts you too, right? And so, I think that is kind of, how we have gotten there, with every improvement, every step, and every right that we've gained. It's because of allies and because of more and more people understanding, having a broader understanding. And I think the same thing is true right now with the Black Lives Matter movement. I don't know if anyone saw the show last night on ESPN, but the entire show was dedicated, the ESPYs was, dedicated to equity and inclusion and telling these stories that are heartbreaking for so many Black athletes and female athletes. And so to have that be the message on this show that millions of people watch, I mean, you can just see that tide turning. And so it's very hopeful. I feel very, very hopeful that we are getting there in so many ways, and that intersectionality right, is really, really evident.
Yeah, everything has been touched on, and I'll just echo having helped run one of the second largest adult recreational leagues in the country. I was kind of at the forefront and saw that one thing that adult hockey and hockey in general actually lacks is diversity. And so setting out with the SPHA, one of our biggest goals is to bring more diversity into the game of ice hockey. It's is a very predominantly white man sport, and I would love nothing more to see more diversity in the sport with women, Asians, Blacks, anybody and everybody who enjoys ice hockey but may not otherwise see it as a welcoming sport. That's what we want to change.
Yeah, and you know what? I would give advice to anyone out there who is on this journey of being an ally, that even employees of You Can Play, who are the supposed experts on the subject, we have to ask ourselves all the time, like, are we still growing as an ally, or doing this work? Because the moment that you get comfortable in your journey as an ally or as a student of this type of work, you probably lost the puck. And, I don't usually like to tell people to, grip the stick a little harder, but, you need to, stay firm and continue to grow, because, and be okay with being uncomfortable, with asking uncomfortable questions, with ceding the space. And for some people who, believe like, well, I have to also make it about my brand. The key thing about being a great ally is it's not about you. It's not about your anger and frustration. It's about amplifying those stories and experiences of those who have truly faced this level of discrimination and who feel that pain, because words matter, right? When you hear that one time out of an entire hockey season, when you hear a homophobic, racist, or sexist slur at an NHL event, it affects you. It affects you as a fan, but it affects members of those particular communities even more. So what would you say to an organization like NHL Seattle, which has already demonstrated its willingness to be extremely collaborative? How do we have an impact on the entire hockey community? So from the experience at an NHL Seattle game, down to some of the youth hockey programs that the organization is going to create, how do we really make sure that it's truly inclusive?
This next generation, they are so open and open-minded. I've got a couple of daughters who are in high school right now, and they have friends who are out, and they've been out since middle school, right? And it's like, when I was growing up, that was not a thing, right? We didn't talk about that. That was not okay. It's okay now, right? And I think being a super inclusive environment for kids to come and enjoy the game and learn the game and make sure that you're, creating that environment is, this next generation, they're ready to go, right? All you need to do is just let them play and create that environment for them that's safe.
Yeah, no, this is a great question, and one that kind of touches home a little bit. So I actually started playing with something called Pride Tape, which I'm sure a handful of communities pretty familiar with. It's essentially rainbow-colored hockey tape that you can tape your stick up with, and that's actually kind of the way I came out to my teammates back when I was playing in the Midwest. And it was this tool that I used to kind of queer the space around me and make it a little more acceptable and at least open up some of that conversation. And I thought that was super helpful. And, since they launched a few years ago, I've seen players in the NHL start using it. I've seen it kind of, cover the globe on ice rinks, and the tape is starting to expand into some other sports like baseball now. As a young player, if I were to see, my idol back in Minnesota in the Wild, like Marian Gaborik back in the day, if he would have, thrown some pride tape on his stick and started playing during a game, that would have changed my whole perception growing up of what it meant to be gay and playing hockey. So as a challenge, I'd hope some of the players that show up in Seattle can at least, do something like that to at least, open the conversation and shed some light into it.
Anytime an organization, Nike, Adidas, NHL itself, or any of the club teams, an electronics company, anytime they announce any sort of support or allyship during Pride Month, as an example, it's always very interesting to go through and see the comments that people post. And it just goes to show that there's still a long ways to go in that regard, because there's still a lot of hate and homophobia that still exists out there. And so it would be great to see more companies step up against that sort of stuff on their respective pages or anywhere out in social media. I know the NHL posted something with the Madison Gay Hockey Association, and it received a lot of negativity or homophobic comments, and they ended up just turning off the comments altogether. So I feel like that was a pretty bold statement itself. There was no one way or the other. It was just a bold statement and just turning off the whole comment section. So it just shut down the platform of posting all of that hate.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I wanted to actually ask Kyle from the NHL Seattle organization about another form, which is coaching education, because You Can Play works with all of our NHL partners to provide coaching education in the youth format where it's appropriate. We work with a number of NHL teams, and the NHL is super supportive. And so, I wanted to address the role of coaching education, and maybe since NHL Seattle has taken this role in developing future generations the way a lot of our newer organizations in the NHL have done. Kyle, can you talk a little bit about how coaching education and that youth organization will be a part of this process of providing a more inclusive environment?
Yeah, definitely. We think a lot about what is this, how do we live this value, or how do we live these values, as Trinity was alluding to earlier, throughout the year. So not just something that it's certain month, and this is the time where we need to cover this content or have this kind of discussion. And I think one of the great ways to continue to make sure that we're living these values is to make sure that we're training coaches at the beginning of the season, in the middle of the season, or right before playoffs, when sometimes coaches and teams and parents are more focused on winning than some of the lessons that the game provides. And so we think a lot about not only who our coaching staff, consists of, who they look like or what they look like and the communities they represent, but also what are we teaching them, and how do we go beyond just kind of some of the X's and O's around learning about how to coach the game or how to teach a certain drill or skill, and how do we encourage them to be leaders for the young people that they're serving, and how do we get them to impart life lessons that will extend far beyond the actual game of hockey. We think about, the material that we're going to present to them, with a great partnership with You Can Play, but obviously partnerships with all of our other community allies. We're building 3 community rinks up at Northgate here in North Seattle. 2 will be kind of dedicated to community use full time, and 1 will be the main practice rink for the NHL team. And what does it mean for an organization like Seattle Pride Hockey Association to have a practice, and for some of our players to go next door and to see and talk with some of the youth that might be participating, or some of the adults that might be participating in some of their programs and might consider coaching in their future? And how do we, ensure that this isn't a message where, it's as a fellow Minnesotan and a Marian Gaborik fan myself, it's great to see those NHL players from a distance and behind the glass and playing at that level down at Seattle Center. But what does it mean when you can kind of casually bump into an NHL player at your practice rink? who's walking by and they also just went through practice? And how do we have these conversations, at the beginning of the season, in the middle of the season, around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and educating our players to feel comfortable speaking out on topics like this and feeling like they can use their platform to really address some of the systemic inequalities that are a part of our American system, and how do they feel they can leverage their resources and assets and voice to make a real difference in our communities. So we think about coaches primarily, obviously as an organization, but then we also can extend that to our parents and our fans generally. We know that we're going to have fans who come to watch an NHL practice in that facility. We know that we're going to have parents who are signing up at the beginning of the year. Hopefully those conversations extend beyond, drop your kid off on time, make sure that they have all of their equipment and all that stuff. How can we engage them in a deeper parent community where they, feel more comfortable about addressing another parent who might say something up in the stands, or bringing to us their concerns with someone who might be in our facility and is not acting according to our values. So how do we just make kind of that broader, a broader base for allyship, as we were talking about earlier? How do we get more people into the fold and having kind of a deeper conversation? Because I think that is one of the great parts about being a part of an NHL organization in many ways, is that so many people are interested in kind of coming together around the team, that we can also challenge them to make sure that they're living our values every day.
And that's why we call him Coach Kyle around the You Can Play organization, because he means it, right? And I actually feel bad for those parents who might be a little late to that 6 a.m. ice time, because, Coach Kyle practices what he preaches, and that's what a coach should do. It's all about model behavior, and I'm really looking forward to that relationship. And, we say, we talk a lot about the intersection of sport and politics, and people are generally like, leave them apart. But this is all part of the conversation. And the Supreme Court came out with a ruling last Monday that obviously is going to have a huge effect on everyone across the board. So I wanted to get some of the reactions to that ruling, about its meaning to you personally, about also how you think it might affect our work in a very positive way, in terms of other people having maybe an aha moment about, wow, like if the Supreme Court, regardless of political orientation, is saying this matters, maybe I better pay attention to that. So why don't you just go around and get everyone's sort of reactions and how you think it might help our efforts?
I'm a Northwest native. I've born and raised in the Seattle area. And so I feel like, living a little bit in a bubble up here, right? We've had, protection and equity for quite a while in the state of Washington, in terms of marriage and terms of, not being able to be fired from your job for being gay. And so when you really step back and think about, about half the country did not have that same protection, at least half the states, it kind of makes my jaw drop a little bit, right? It's like, well, you could go to work and be gay and be fired for it is kind of a crazy idea. So this court decision is huge. It's just huge to move us forward to the next level. I'm sure it's very, very eye-opening for many, many people across the country, but it is very significant.
Yeah, I'm very excited as well. As Trinity stated, I've also from the Seattle area and very much in the bubble up here, and have never really had an opportunity to realize how many people are still terminated for being gay or lesbian. And so I'm very happy to see that this is an official ruling that you cannot, and it'll be great for it'll be great for people to be able to go to work and feel safe and not feel like they can be terminated for just being who they are.
Yeah, no, really, really good things you've both added. One of my favorite quotes is actually from Martin Luther King, and it's, "Let us realize the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." And I think, in the context of this, I think, we finally hit that point in that regard. We finally bended towards justice, and like Trinity said, I think it's a wake up call for a lot of folks in states where this wasn't the law. That this is where things are headed, and we're headed towards equality and equity for everyone. And I think as this is a moment to celebrate, I think it's also a moment to look at the agenda. What's next? There's a lot of protections for trans folks that I think we need to really focus and dial in on. States across the country are, whether it be through sports, whether it be in bathrooms, all sorts of conversations going on. But I think there's so many different protections that those folks need, and I think that's the next chapter of this story. And I think there's so much momentum we're seeing across the country in so many different ways that let's focus our efforts now on this next thing.
Yeah, I want to echo what everyone has said, and Joey just said so beautifully. But I would just say that the thing that stands out to me, and other people have touched on this too, is how interconnected not only our world increasingly is, but how interconnected and interdependent we are on people who are living a state away or 2 states away or 5 states away, and their experience, while we might think could be very similar, it could be vastly different. And that, one of the things that encourages me is that there's just increased national momentum around not only this movement, but so many others for underrepresented minorities. And how do we keep a national spotlight going so people and groups and communities don't feel like they're at it alone?
Excellent. Thank you for all sharing that with us. And obviously, this is Pride Month. We'd normally be walking in a parade and having a celebration almost as a culmination of the rest of the year's events. And instead, we're having very serious conversations, but arguably more impactful than your traditional Pride parade. So I appreciate everyone, even on this call, being a little uncomfortable and talking openly about your roles, as advocates within the LGBTQ community, as allies to other underrepresented groups in hockey. And so, being conscientious of time, I wanted to give everyone kind of like a final moment to maybe give advice to NHL Seattle fans and administrators about maybe what your most important piece going forward would be, your most important piece of advice. And what I'll say is that when you go to a game, what's going to matter most is that you pull on that NHL Seattle hockey sweater, and that's going to be your defining characteristic. And you have the right to not hear negative sentiment about your true self. What matters most is that you've shown up. And so, if you hear that type of language, whether you're, a traditional family with your kids around, it's okay for you to turn around and say, hey, we're NHL Seattle, and that's not acceptable language. And I don't want my kids to hear it. And I don't feel that you represent, our community very well. And that it's okay to take that risk and say something. And there will obviously be, ways to do that in a safe manner. There are ways to report that type of behavior in an anonymous manner if you don't feel comfortable with that. But, staying completely silent and doing nothing, especially in a community that is generally more accepting of all cultures and backgrounds, doing nothing is probably not the acceptable thing to do. Let's get comfortable being uncomfortable and doing something in that situation. So
I think anybody that loves the sport of ice hockey and wants to get involved is now is a perfect time. There's been tremendous growth in the sport over the last couple of years, and this is the perfect opportunity to stand up and become part of it, whether you want to become a fan of the incoming NHL Seattle team, or you want to don on some gear and learn how to play. Don't be afraid. This is a perfect opportunity to get involved, and Seattle Pride Hockey Association is looking forward to hosting numerous events when it is safe to do so, to include try hockey. Adults can come out and try on some gear and some skates, and we've done it for the youth sometime last year, and it was super fun. And so we are one of our objectives is to do the same for adults that want to learn to play.
I would say, use the platform. NHL Seattle, obviously a Seattle team. Seattle has always been on the tip of the spear as it relates to progressive change and, equity. So use the platform. Other Seattle teams have done that very, very well. And, this team is going to have a huge, huge reach, and it's going to be able to positively impact a lot of people. And so, take those moments, right? Take those moments to promote diversity, equity, inclusion, to promote gender equity, to promote pay equity. Those kinds of things will be very, very well received, obviously in this community, but I think in the rest of the country as we move forward.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar there, Trinity. As you look at some of the events going on, even as early as today, in NASCAR, another sport, you saw a player with a noose hung in their garage, which is just a horrifying example of just how much more work needs to be done, even in a different community, for the Black community, for the LGBTQ community. I think it's upon us, and as a new organization for NHL Seattle to disrupt those things and kind of be a voice that cuts through the chaos and all the back and forth that we're seeing, and just really be a clear and concise leader and say, this is absolutely not tolerated.
I don't think I have anything to add, Joe. I think that everything's been well said, and for me, it's just a matter of making sure that we live these things and take this to the next step, because I think all of these points are not only where we want to go, but it's partners like these that will help us ultimately get there.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you to NHL Seattle for using your platform like this during what it has to be called the most unique Pride Month in its history. Arguably even greater than the 50-year anniversary last year. If you're looking for more information, if you're new to the role as an ally, whether you're a hockey player, a parent, or just someone from the Seattle community, check all these organizations out on social media. Look for combined events. I can guarantee you that we'll be putting our heads together to do, various fundraisers and celebrate, this vision as we go into live hockey for the next season. And the key to everything as an ally is that consistent commitment. And I can tell you that NHL Seattle has already demonstrated this to great effect, and we'll continue to work on a variety of projects. You can find out more information about You Can Play by going on our website. During this Pride Month, there's a lot of Pride panels and Instagram live stories from various sports people and people who are sharing their story. There's an auction happening right now. We're just so excited about this relationship going forward. So happy Pride to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you at Pride Night in Seattle in the near future. Thank you.